December 1941. The Leningrad sector along the Soviet-Finnish border. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov crouched in a frozen trench and watched another one of his men die. The young soldier had been on night patrol when German bullets found him in the dark. He was the 8th man Volkov had lost in 3 weeks. The temperature outside was 35 degrees below 0 Celsius, the kind of cold that turned spit into ice before it hit the ground, the kind of cold that made metal stick to skin. And it was in this cold that Volkov's superiors had just banned his Snowbank Tripwire idea before he could even build it. The problem was simple but deadly. SS reconnaissance units were slipping through Soviet lines almost every night. They wore white winter camouflage that made them invisible against the snow. They moved like ghosts between the positions. In the first 3 weeks of December, 40% of Soviet patrols in this sector had been ambushed or killed. That meant 4 out of every 10 men sent out into the night never came back. The numbers were getting worse each day. Volkov had been a civil engineer before the war. He built bridges and roads in Leningrad. He understood weight distribution and structural stress and how materials behaved under pressure. He was not a career military man. He did not grow up learning tactics at some academy. The army had given him a rifle and a rank and sent him to this frozen hell to hold a line against the Germans. But his engineering mind never stopped working. It never stopped seeing problems that needed solutions. The Soviet defenses relied on the same methods every army had used for years. They strung wire between posts to slow enemy soldiers. They buried landmines in the ground to blow up anyone who stepped wrong. They dug trenches and waited. These methods worked fine in normal conditions, but nothing about the Eastern Front in winter was normal. The tripwires that were supposed to catch enemy soldiers froze solid in the extreme cold. When metal wire froze at 35 below, it became stiff and visible. Enemy patrols could see it from 10 feet away and simply step over it. The wire that was supposed to save lives became useless decoration. The landmines were even worse. Soviet soldiers would bury them in the snow, but then more snow would fall. 2 inches of fresh snow made the mines impossible to detect, even for the soldiers who had buried them. The mines would sink deeper into the snowpack. Sometimes they would freeze and not detonate at all. Sometimes Soviet soldiers would forget where they placed them and blow themselves up. The defensive system was failing and men were dying because of it. Volkov had brought his idea to Major Konstantin 3 days earlier. He had explained how they could build artificial ridges out of snow itself. They could shape the snow into structures that looked natural but would collapse when stepped on. The collapse would make noise. It would slow enemy soldiers. It would give Soviet machine gunners time to aim and fire. Volkov had drawn diagrams. He had shown the math. He had explained exactly how the weight of a man would trigger the collapse. Major Konstantin had looked at the drawings for maybe 30 seconds. Then he had pushed them back across the table. "Snow is not stable," he said. "It shifts. It melts. It blows away in the wind. You want me to trust the lives of my men to a pile of snow? Request denied." When Volkov tried to argue, the major cut him off. "This is not a construction site, Lieutenant. This is war. We use proven methods. We use steel and explosives, not snow." 2 other officers had been in that meeting. They had both nodded in agreement. One of them, a captain with medals from the Finnish Winter War, had actually laughed. "Next, he will want to build fortifications out of ice cream," the captain said. The other officers smiled. Volkov had left the meeting with his drawings and his anger and no permission to test his idea. But the dying continued. Every night brought more casualties. Every morning brought more bodies carried back on stretchers. The conventional methods kept failing. The frozen tripwires caught nothing but wind. The buried mines stayed silent under their blanket of snow. The SS patrols kept penetrating deeper into Soviet positions. They gathered intelligence. They cut communication lines. They killed sentries and disappeared back into the white darkness. Volkov spent his nights in the trench thinking about snow, not just thinking about it as something cold and wet, thinking about it as an engineering material. Snow had weight. Snow had structure. Snow could be shaped and compressed and turned into something solid. The Inuit people built houses out of snow that could withstand Arctic storms. If snow could protect people from weather, why could it not be used against people in war? The idea that kept returning to him was this: everyone was trying to fight against the snow and cold. They were trying to make their normal weapons work despite the winter. But what if they did the opposite? What if they used the snow itself as a weapon? What if they made the environment fight for them instead of against them? The snow was already there. It cost nothing. It fell from the sky for free, and the Germans had to walk through it to reach Soviet lines. Volkov knew his commanders would not listen to him again. He had made his pitch and been rejected. In the army, you did not get many chances to challenge your superiors. But he also knew that if he did nothing, more men would die. The conventional wisdom was failing. The proven methods were not working. And sometimes, Volkov thought, the biggest threat to survival was not the enemy. It was the refusal to try something new. Volkov began his work in secret on a night when the moon was hidden behind clouds. He gathered 6 soldiers he trusted. These were men who had served with him since October, men who had seen too many friends die, men who were willing to try something different, even if it meant breaking orders. They met at the north end of the trench line at 11 o'clock at night when most of the camp was asleep. Volkov brought his drawings and a bucket of water he had kept warming over a small fire. The design was precise because it had to be. Volkov explained it to his men in whispers. They would build a ridge of snow exactly 18 inches high. The ridge would run parallel to their trench at a distance of exactly 42 inches. This distance was critical. Too close, and Soviet soldiers might accidentally trigger it. Too far, and it would not provide enough warning time. 42 inches gave them 3 seconds. 3 seconds for a machine gunner to swing his weapon and acquire a target. But the ridge could not be just packed snow. Packed snow was too solid. A man could step on it and it might not collapse. Volkov needed it to collapse under a specific weight. He had calculated that an average German soldier with winter gear and weapons weighed about 68 kilograms. That was 150 pounds. The snow structure had to hold its own weight but fail instantly when a man stepped on it. The secret was in the internal framework. Volkov had his men gather birch branches from a small grove 200 meters behind the lines. The branches needed to be thin enough to bend but thick enough to provide structure. They arranged these branches inside the snow ridge at an angle of 23 degrees. This was not a random number. 23 degrees created a collapse zone. When weight pressed down from above, the angled branches would bend and snap in sequence. One branch breaking would cause the next to break. The whole section would fail in less than a second. It would sound like someone stepping through thin ice. They worked for 3 hours building a test section 20 feet long. Their fingers went numb even through gloves. They had to stop every 15 minutes to warm their hands under their coats. When the basic shape was done, Volkov brought out his bucket of water. The water temperature was exactly negative 12 degrees Celsius. This temperature was critical. Water any warmer would melt the snow too much. Water any colder would freeze before it soaked in properly. At negative 12 degrees, the water would seep into the snow structure and freeze into a shell exactly 3 millimeters thick. Volkov poured the water carefully along the top of the ridge. His men watched the water disappear into the snow, and then watched frost form on the surface. Within 10 minutes, they had created an ice shell. Volkov pressed his hand against it. It felt solid. But he knew from his engineering calculations that 3 millimeters of ice at this temperature would shatter like glass under the impact of a falling man. The shell would hold the shape, but not the weight. They tested it at first light. One of the soldiers, a young man named Alexei, who weighed about 70 kilograms, walked toward the ridge. He placed his boot on top of it. The ridge held for half a second. Then it gave way with a sharp cracking sound that echoed across the frozen field. Alexei dropped 8 inches into the collapsed snow. His leg was not hurt, but he was stuck. It took him almost 30 seconds to pull himself free. 30 seconds was an eternity in combat. 30 seconds was enough time to die 10 times over. Volkov knew he had something that worked, but he also knew he had no permission to use it. He needed someone with authority to take a risk. That someone turned out to be Captain Mikhail Petrov. Petrov commanded a company 3 trenches down from Volkov's position. He had lost 12 men in the past 2 weeks. He was angry and desperate and willing to listen to crazy ideas. When Volkov showed him the collapsed section of snow, Petrov stared at it for a long time. Then he said, "You have 72 hours. If nothing happens, you take it down. If something happens and it works, I will take the blame with you." Volkov and his men extended the snow ridge to 60 feet. They worked during the day this time because Petrov gave them cover. If anyone asked, they were reinforcing the trench walls. The work took 18 hours spread across 2 days. They built the framework. They poured the water. They created a continuous line of artificial snow that looked almost natural in the landscape. Then they waited. The first 8 days brought nothing. No German patrols came near their section. Volkov began to worry that his unauthorized experiment would be discovered before it could prove itself. Some of the soldiers who had helped build it started to make jokes. They called it Volkov's frozen folly. But on the 9th night, everything changed. It was 4:30 in the morning, the darkest part of night before dawn. Volkov was on watch when he heard the crack. It was not loud, but it was distinct, the sound of structure failing. He grabbed his rifle and looked out into the darkness. He could see shapes moving in the snow, white shapes against white background. 14 men in German winter camouflage. They had triggered the collapse, and now they were trying to extract themselves from the broken snow. Some were stuck. Some were helping others. All of them were exposed. Volkov opened fire. The machine gunner to his left opened fire. The riflemen in the trench opened fire. The Germans tried to return fire, but they were off balance and stuck and visible. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. When it was over, 11 German soldiers lay dead or dying in the snow. 3 had managed to escape back into the darkness. Soviet casualties were 0. Word spread fast. Within 2 days, Volkov's section recorded 2 more successful interceptions. The snow ridges caught enemy patrols that standard defenses had missed completely. Captain Petrov sent a report up the chain of command. He included the casualty numbers: 11 enemy killed with 0 friendly losses, then 19 enemy killed across 3 engagements with 0 friendly losses. The numbers were impossible to ignore. The sector commander was facing relief. His defensive line had been penetrated so many times that headquarters was considering replacing him. He was desperate for anything that worked. When he read Petrov's report, he made a decision. He ordered the construction of 200 meters of snowbank tripwires, despite the official ban from above. He put 40 men on the job. They worked for 36 straight hours in the freezing cold. They built the frameworks. They poured the water. They created a network of hidden traps that cost almost nothing but Soviet sweat and snow that fell from the sky. The numbers told a story that no amount of military tradition could argue against. In the 4 weeks before Volkov's Snowbank Tripwires, the Leningrad sector had recorded 127 nighttime infiltrations by German forces. That was more than 4 enemy penetrations every single night. Soviet patrols had been ambushed. Communication lines had been cut. Sentries had been killed in the dark. The defensive line was bleeding, and everyone knew it. But in the 4 weeks after the installation of the Snowbank system, from December 29th to January 25th, there were only 19 infiltration attempts. Of those 19 attempts, 14 were detected and repelled before the enemy could cause any damage. The infiltration success rate had dropped from nearly 100% to just 11%. The sector commander looked at these numbers and made the biggest decision of his career. In late January of 1942, he ordered the construction of 12 kilometers of snowbank tripwires along the entire defensive line. 12 kilometers was almost 7.5 miles. It was an enormous undertaking. The work required 340 man-hours for every kilometer. That meant over 4,000 hours of labor in conditions where the temperature rarely rose above -20 degrees Celsius. Soldiers worked in shifts. They gathered birch branches from every grove within 5 kilometers. They built the frameworks with frozen fingers. They heated water over fires and poured it carefully to create the ice shells. They worked through the night because the Germans attacked at night. The construction became a race against time and weather. The snowbank tripwires had one major weakness. They only lasted about 4 days before weather destroyed them. New snow would cover them and change their structure. Wind would erode the ridges. Temperature changes would crack the ice shells. Every 4 days, crews had to rebuild sections. It was exhausting work, but it was effective work. And in war, effective was all that mattered. The contrast with other sectors was dramatic. 3 kilometers to the south, Soviet forces were still using conventional wire defenses. They had not adopted Volkov's method. In that southern sector, the infiltration success rate remained at 60%. 6 out of every 10 German patrols got through the defenses, but in Volkov's sector, only 11% succeeded. The difference was so stark that soldiers from other units began requesting transfers. They wanted to serve in the sector with the snow walls. They wanted to survive the winter. Before the snowbank tripwires, the situation had been desperate in ways that statistics alone could not capture. German SS reconnaissance units had owned the night. They moved with confidence because they knew Soviet defenses were frozen and useless. They would approach the trenches in groups of 8 to 15 men. They wore white camouflage that made them invisible until they were within 20 meters. By the time Soviet sentries saw them, it was often too late. The Germans would throw grenades into the trenches. They would shoot anyone who moved. They would take papers and maps from dead officers. Then they would disappear back into the darkness. Soviet soldiers lived in constant fear during the night watch. Every shadow could be death. Every sound could be the enemy. The psychological strain was almost as damaging as the casualties. But the snowbank tripwires changed the balance of fear. Now the Germans were the ones who had to worry about every step. They could not see the snow ridges in the dark. The ridges looked like natural drifts. When a patrol triggered a collapse, the cracking sound would echo across the frozen field. Soviet machine gunners would open fire instantly. The Germans found themselves caught in a trap made of frozen water and branches. They were exposed and stuck and dying. After 3 weeks of heavy casualties, German units began to avoid Volkov's sector entirely. Intelligence reports showed that enemy commanders were redeploying their patrols to sectors that still used conventional defenses. The Snowbank Tripwires had created a zone that the enemy simply refused to enter. Then came the event that made Volkov's innovation legendary. On February 3, 1942, a large SS patrol of 23 men approached the Soviet lines at 2 in the morning. They were experienced soldiers. They had survived months of Eastern Front combat. They moved in a spread formation to reduce casualties from mines. But they did not know about the 60-meter section of interconnected snow ridges that Volkov's teams had built the previous day. When the lead man triggered the first collapse, it started a chain reaction. One section failed and the weight shifted to the next section. That section failed and shifted weight to the next. Within 5 seconds, 60 meters of snow structure collapsed in a cascading wave. All 23 German soldiers found themselves waist-deep in broken snow and exposed ice. The Soviet response was overwhelming. 3 machine gun positions opened fire simultaneously. Riflemen shot from the trenches. Flares went up to illuminate the killing zone. The Germans tried to return fire, but they could not move. They could not take cover. They could not run. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. When it ended, 12 German soldiers were dead. 8 were wounded and captured. Only 3 managed to escape back to their lines. It was the single most successful defensive action in the sector since the start of winter. The captured Germans provided something even more valuable than the tactical victory. They carried documents, maps, orders, communication codes. During interrogation, they revealed details about a planned offensive. German forces were preparing to push hard against the Soviet lines in mid-February. They were gathering troops and supplies. The intelligence from those 8 prisoners allowed Soviet commanders to reinforce weak points and prepare for the attack. When the German offensive came, it failed. The element of surprise was gone. Volkov's Snowbank. Tripwires had not just killed enemy soldiers. They had captured intelligence that saved hundreds of Soviet lives. By mid-February, the ban on Snowbank Tripwires was officially lifted. What had been forbidden was now authorized. Orders came down from Leningrad Front headquarters. All defensive sectors were to implement the snow ridge system where conditions allowed. Volkov was called to headquarters to brief other officers on the construction technique. He stood in a warm room in front of 40 commanders and explained the mathematics of collapse angles and ice shell thickness. Some of the officers were the same ones who had laughed at his idea 6 weeks earlier. They were not laughing anymore. They were taking notes. The deployment accelerated rapidly. By March of 1942, over 400 kilometers of snowbank tripwires protected Soviet positions along the Leningrad front. 400 kilometers was nearly 250 miles. Thousands of soldiers were involved in construction and maintenance. The technique spread to other fronts. Reports came in from sectors using the system. Infiltration rates dropped. Casualties decreased. Morale improved. The innovation that one engineer had conceived in a frozen trench was now changing the nature of winter warfare across the entire Eastern Front. And the Germans, who had once moved through the snow like ghosts, now feared the snow itself. The snowbank tripwire technique did not end when the winter of 1942 ended. As spring came and the snow melted, the immediate tactical use disappeared, but the principle behind it remained. The idea that you could turn the environment itself into a weapon. The idea that nature could fight on your side if you understood its properties. This concept spread far beyond the frozen trenches of Leningrad. Finnish forces took particular interest in the technique. Finland had been fighting its own war against the Soviet Union during the same winter. Finnish soldiers were experts in snow warfare. They had used skis and white camouflage and forest ambushes to defeat much larger Soviet forces. When reports of Volkov's Snowbank Tripwires reached Finnish military intelligence, their engineers studied the design carefully. They refined it. They made improvements based on their own experience with different types of snow. Finnish military doctrine began to incorporate artificial snow structures as standard defensive measures. When Finnish advisors later trained troops for other winter conflicts, they brought this knowledge with them. In 1950, during the Korean War, American Marines fought a brutal winter campaign in the mountains near the Chosin Reservoir. Temperatures dropped to -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Chinese forces attacked in waves during the night. American defensive positions struggled with the same problems the Soviets had faced 9 years earlier: frozen tripwires, buried mines that would not detonate. Then a Finnish military advisor attached to the Marine Division suggested something unusual. He had learned about snow-structured defenses during the Winter War. He showed Marine engineers how to build collapsible snow ridges. The Americans called them ice walls. They built them around key positions. When Chinese troops triggered the collapses, the cracking sound gave Marines precious seconds of warning. Several documented engagements showed the technique working, just as it had on the Eastern Front. The principle Volkov had developed in desperation had crossed continents and conflicts. But the most significant evolution came in an entirely different field. In the 1960s and 70s, scientists studying avalanches began to understand snow structure in new ways. They realized that avalanches were essentially massive collapse events. A layer of snow would fail under its own weight or external pressure. That failure would cascade across an entire slope. The same physics that made Volkov's tripwires work made avalanches deadly. Engineers in Switzerland and Norway began developing avalanche trigger systems. These systems would intentionally collapse unstable snow before it could become dangerous. They used the same principles of structural failure and cascade collapse that Volkov had figured out in a frozen trench. Modern ski resorts around the world now use controlled collapse technology to keep slopes safe. The science of making snow fail in predictable ways traces a direct line back to winter warfare on the Eastern Front. Border patrol agencies in Scandinavian countries adopted similar technology. Norway and Sweden both have long borders that cross Arctic terrain. It is impossible to patrol every kilometer with human guards, but snow structure sensors can detect when something heavy moves through an area. Modern systems use the same collapse trigger principle. When snow structures fail, electronic sensors register the event. Border guards receive alerts. The technology is more sophisticated than water and birch branches, but the core concept remains identical. Use the environment as your first line of detection. As for Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov himself, his story took a different path than his innovation. He survived the war. He fought through the siege of Leningrad. He saw the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. When the war ended, he returned to what he knew best. He went back to civil engineering. From 1955 to 1963, he worked on the Leningrad metro system. He designed stations. He calculated load-bearing walls. He ensured that thousands of people could travel safely underground. It was quiet work compared to war. It was work that built instead of destroyed. Volkov seemed content with it. But here is what Volkov never received. He never got official military recognition for his innovation. His name does not appear on any commendations from the war. There is no medal, no official document crediting him as the inventor of the Snowbank Tripwire system. Soviet military records from that period attribute the technique to collective ingenuity. This was common in Soviet culture. Individual achievement was often absorbed into group achievement. The state took credit. the party took credit. Individual engineers and soldiers were forgotten. Volkov never complained about this publicly. Perhaps he understood that survival was its own reward. Perhaps he knew that the hundreds of lives his innovation saved mattered more than recognition. Volkov died in 1979 at the age of 63. His obituary in the Leningrad newspaper mentioned his work on the metro. It mentioned his service in the war. It did not mention the Snowbank Tripwires. For 11 years after his death, the technique remained attributed to unnamed Soviet military engineers. Then, in 1990, the Soviet Union began to collapse. Archives opened. Declassified documents became available to historians. A researcher studying winter warfare tactics found Captain Petrov's original report from January 1942. The report named Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov as the designer of the Snow Ridge defensive system. Other documents emerged, testimony from soldiers who had served with him, engineering diagrams in his handwriting. The full story came together 30 years too late for Volkov to know that history had finally recorded his name. Today, the principle Volkov discovered is taught in Arctic warfare schools around the world. Military doctrine has a term for it now. Environmental weaponization. It means exactly what it sounds like. Using the natural environment as part of your defensive or offensive capability. Instead of fighting against weather and terrain, you make them fight for you. Desert forces use sand. Jungle forces use vegetation. Arctic forces use snow and ice. The environment is always there. It costs nothing. It cannot be destroyed by enemy fire. It just requires someone creative enough to see how to use it. The broader lesson extends beyond military applications. Innovation often comes from unlikely sources. Volkov was not a career soldier. He was an engineer who found himself in a war. He looked at a problem that everyone else accepted as unsolvable. He saw failure where others saw frozen wire and buried mines. But instead of accepting that failure, he asked a different question. Not how can we make our old methods work in new conditions, but how can we use the new conditions themselves as our method? That shift in thinking changed everything. Contemporary challenges often require the same mental shift. Climate change, resource scarcity, technological disruption. These are not problems that old solutions will fix. They require people willing to look at the environment differently, to see opportunity in what others see as obstacles, to build weapons out of snowbanks when everyone else is trying to import steel wire that freezes and breaks. The story of the Snowbank Tripwire is ultimately about unexpected solutions, about the value of listening to unconventional ideas, about the danger of rejecting innovation simply because it does not fit traditional methods. A pile of snow seemed like the least reliable defensive structure imaginable. It seemed fragile and temporary and absurd, until it trapped an entire SS patrol and changed the course of winter warfare. The best weapons are not always forged in factories. Sometimes they are built from the very conditions everyone else is trying to survive. Sometimes the answer to an impossible problem is lying on the ground all around you, waiting for someone to see it differently.